These are my trusty winding sticks. I made them some time ago, but they have a few limitations. In particular, they're not made with quarter sawn grain, so they move in the wrong direction. It's time to replace them, and I'm going to make some winding sticks that make it easier for you to see what I'm doing. Let's look at how I did it. The winding sticks come in a pair. Typically, one side is just solid, and the second one has highlights of some sort. And the idea is that when you put them on the board, the highlights will show where one side is higher than the other, which indicates that there is some twist or wind in the board. What we want is for them to cover up the highlights completely. That means that the board is flat. And the way they work is you put the solid stick on the end closest to you, where you'll be looking from, and you put the highlight stick at the other end. And then you squat down and you slide across the top to identify where the wind is. And from where I'm squatting, I can see that this corner is high, and so is the one to the back left. And to fix that, what I would do is simply take a hand plane and remove shavings at this corner and that corner, and check again. But to make it easier for you, I'm going to turn around the winding sticks so you can see what I'm seeing. When you have a look at the winding stick, on the left-hand side, you will see that there is a sliver of white or light-coloured timber. That is showing which side is high. Grain selection for the winding sticks is actually very important, because we know that timber tends to expand and contract along the grain lines. And with this board, you can see that it's curved here and flat here. So what I want to do is have minimal movement up and down, which means that this section here where the grain lines are flattened out is the section that I want. So I'm probably going to cut it about there and then build my winding sticks out of here. The first part of the milling process is to take that wide board and then rip off the quarter sawn blank that I want to use. Once that was done, I resawed it to get the two winding sticks. And I brought them to a rough thickness on the thicknesser. Once that was done, I let it set for 2 weeks to let any tension come out. And then I used a hand plane to remove all the machine marks on all 4 edges, before using a wheel gauge to set the final size. And then I used my hand plane to finish the milling. I will periodically check the flatness of the board using a long steel rule. This will help to ensure that I remove any bumps and leave a nice flat edge. I used maple highlights to give a good contrast with the Fijian Mahogany sticks. I marked the highlights to rough size and then cut them out using my Japanese saw. I'm using my shooting board just as a place to hold the wood while I'm sawing. I use my shooting board to square up the ends of the highlights to make them a tight fit. A small mortise is made on each end of the inside face of each stick to house the highlights. I'm using a marking gauge and a marking knife to mark out the mortises for the highlights because I'm going to use a chisel to chop out the waste. The lines left by the marking gauge and the marking knife provide an ideal place for the chisel to rest in while I'm starting the cut. This will help with accuracy and the highlight will fit snugly into the mortise. Here I'm using a chisel to chop out the waste in the mortise. I take small cuts along the length of the mortise, and these cuts are only a couple millimeters thick. Chopping the waste like this makes it so much easier to pare it away using a chisel. Depending on the depth of the mortise, you might need to repeat this several times to complete the work. I should have used clamping coils when gluing in the highlights, because this would have produced a better glue joint overall. Fortunately, I got lucky. And then I used a hand plane to bring the highlights flush with the winding stick. I used my shooting board to ensure that the ends of the highlights were square and flush to the ends of the winding sticks. I wanted to use magnets to hold the sticks together to make storage easier. But you need to pay better attention to the polarity of the magnets than I did so that they work properly. I was an idiot and installed one backwards. Here I'm marking out the center points for the magnets, and these holes were drilled on the drill press. To work properly, winding sticks need to be placed centrally across the board that you're checking, so I'm using brass rod as the center markers on the winding sticks. used a small V-groove block to cut the brass rod and a file to clean them up. They'll be epoxied in later. I'm using some 5-minute epoxy to glue in the magnets and the brass rods. This comes in tube form, so it's very easy to mix. Make sure you check the polarity of the magnets so that you don't put one in back to front like I did. I'm putting a chamfer along the leading edge of each stick to reduce some weight and also to add a little bit of style to the winding sticks. You could leave them square if you wish. The lines from the marking gauge show where the chamfer is to go, but sometimes they are difficult to see. I run a thin pencil down the line left by the marking gauge so I can easily see when to stop planing. I use a hand plane to make the chamfer. I find it much safer to do it this way instead of using the table saw. The last thing that I wanted to do before I finished the winding sticks was to ease the edges and make them a bit more human friendly. I intend to use the winding sticks regularly, so I used a block plane to take off the sharp edges and make it easier in my hand. I sprayed on a few coats of spray-on lacquer to protect the winding sticks. Here I'm using my homemade Lazy Susan to turn the winding sticks around while I spray them. .240 before I do this. Now that we've finished our winding sticks, let's try them out. So I put it on this board. I know it's warped or twisted, and it's more so than the one I showed you before. When I squat down and see over it, I can see that it is high on this back corner on my right or your left, and it is high on the front left, my front left, and your right, the front. And you should be able to see exactly that as well, because this white patch here is high, and you should be able to see it over the top of the front winding stick, and you can't see this corner here. So what that means is that it's twisted, and the winding stick has exaggerated it so that this side on the right hand, my right hand, is high, and so is that one at the front left, my front left. Winding sticks are an essential bit of kit that helps you to ensure that your timber is twist free. But they don't have to just be used on a timber board. They could also be used to identify twist in a drawer, like so, or like so. Very useful tools. I hope you enjoyed the video. See you next time. Have a wonderful day.